Well, good morning, everyone. Again. No deer this time. We can go on, I guess. I want to ask you to keep in your prayers the people of Haiti. Evidently, that storm that's cooking down there, it's gone down to a tropical depression or a tropical storm, soon to be a tropical depression, but it looks like it's going to hit Haiti. And, if that hits Pensacola, Florida, a tropical depression, we just sort of blow it off. It's no big deal. But to these people who have nothing and their infrastructure is so fragile, could be quite devastating. I also have heard that there's been some unrest in Haiti, that the government raised the price of gas, and so the folks have kicked up their heels a little bit. I understand that the government has responded positively to that to bring down the temperature. So we want to keep these people in our prayers. I was in conversation with Annette actually through the night. I had a text waiting for me this morning. She's an early bird, kind of like me, I guess. And so we want to keep them in our prayers. I also ask that you keep our students in your prayers as we prepare for this canoe trip. I picked a canoe trip because I think that the first thing we need to do as a youth group is to begin to build teamwork. And there is nothing better to do that than to paddle in the same direction, pick up all your gear, take it across the trail so that you can get back in and paddle again, set up camp, hang your food pack in the trees so the bear don't get it at night. And does that scare you? It shouldn't. It's fun. And do it all over again the next morning. And I think that's the kind of teamwork we need to be looking for our youth. So keep them in your prayers as well. So I read this story, and I immediately remembered a story from my own past. It was Christian, our son. I think he was not quite 4. And one day, it was in the fall, we noticed that he was limping a little bit. And it wasn't really a limp, it was more like just walking on the ball of one foot, rather than putting a foot forward, heel to toe, like we usually do. And we didn't think much of it at first. We sort of looked at it looked okay. It wasn't much there, and he kept doing it, and it kept getting worse. And then it got painful to the touch. And so, of course, we went to the doctor as soon as we discovered that this was probably something a little bigger than we could manage with ointments and Band-Aids and everything else. Doctor didn't quite know what to think. First they thought it was this, then they thought it was that, then we ended up at a specialist, and then they thought it was this, and then they thought it was that. And then when the word cancer came up as a possibility, things started getting serious. And for the next month, we waited without answers, waiting for this test, waiting for that procedure, waiting for these results, waiting. And I remember going to bed every night and asking God why. Hold that thought. So we have been, these last few weeks this summer, we have been going through a sermon series called A Summer of Great Stories, and the subtitle is Weeds or Flowers. Is it up there? There it is there. Weeds or Flowers, A Summer of Great. And we have met a bunch of weeds, haven't we, since we started this thing. The outfit that God raised up from the dust, it's a seedy bunch. First, we had Adam and Eve, and of course, you know that story well. And then we have Cain, who kills his brother Abel because he's jealous. And then we have what I call the first story of Noah, which is really about Noah, but it's really about the way the world has become so cut off from God that God is sorry that he has to start over. He destroys the world with water. And then we have that second story of Noah. As soon as he gets off the boat, he plants a vineyard and gets himself so drunk that he can't even stand up. He's passed out in his tent, naked, and his sons have to cover him in shame. And then last week, the story of the Tower of Babel. And so it's been kind of a seedy bunch. And now we turn the page to chapter 12, and we come to the story of Abraham. And you know what? This one looks a little more promising. So God says to Abraham, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And he says, get up, leave your home, leave your family, take your wife and a few servants, and go to the land that I've promised you. And Abraham probably says, well, where are we going? He says, don't worry, I'll let you know when we're there. And Abraham does this without question. He just gets up and he goes. And then God says, stop. And Abraham stops. He says, this is it. And so we read that. We think, well, finally, we got a flower here in the bunch. Finally, we've got someone who's this sort of, looks like a perfect person who has this perfect faith. Until, of course, we read the next few verses after Abraham stops. Because things start to get a little serious. There's a famine in the land. And Abraham has to leave this place that God has promised him. And he ends up going to Egypt because he's heard there's better things in Egypt. But then he looks at his wife, Sarah, who is beautiful, and he says, we're going to a place where no one knows us. They're going to see her. They're going to want her. They're going to know that I'm her husband. They're going to kill me so they can have her. Tell you what, Sarah, I'm going to tell them that you're my sister. And that's what he does. So the Pharaoh of Egypt notices Sarah, notices her beauty. He's been told about her. He goes to Abraham and says, yeah, that's my sister. Would you like her? Sure. And all of a sudden now, Abraham's treated really well. The Pharaoh starts giving him all kinds of things, all kinds of goodies, cattle. He becomes a very rich man. You know the story? It's kind of cool. And then God sees this happening, and he starts doing some nasty things to Pharaoh until Pharaoh finds out the truth that this is not Abraham's sister, this is Abraham's wife. And he comes to Abraham and says, get out of town. Take your wife and get out of here. I don't want to have anything to do with you. And Abraham leaves with all his riches. Not the flower we thought he was he? Kind of a weed, kind of a seedy character like the rest of them. And so Abraham falters, but God remains true. And God even uses Abraham's faltering to make him great, to give him these riches so that he can go back to the land that's been promised to him and become the great nation that God promised he would. It happens again. God takes Abraham out into the night sky, shows him the sky, and he says, look at the stars. Count them if you can. So shall be the number of your descendants. Abraham says, I don't have any descendants. We can't have children. He said, I'll fix that. And so they wait, and they wait, and they wait. You know this story. They get tired of waiting. So Sarah says, you're going to die an old childless man. There will be no descendants. So take the slave girl, Hagar, have a child with her. At least then you'll have somebody that's an heir to all your wealth. And Abraham does this. And of course, then Sarah becomes pregnant with Isaac, and the family dysfunction begins. Sarah gets jealous of the older child and the slave girl. Abraham, they have to get out now, and they have to leave, and they go to Arabia, of all places, where they become the nation of Islam, the Arabian people. Abraham falters, God remains true. So, if you're looking for a place to hear about perfect people with perfect faith, you will not find it in the Bible. It's not there. It does not exist. What you will find is a God who loves people who falter and remains true to them even when they falter, and sometimes, yes, he even uses their falterings to draw them closer to him. It's a story about imperfect people like you, like me, and a God who remains true. Let's sing. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. Genesis 22, the lesson I just read to you, and I looked back, I've only preached on this sermon once in my career, and it was a rotten sermon. It was just, but imagine preaching on this thing. This is a tough lesson. Things get, if things were serious before with famine and no child, things really get serious here. So the story begins, after these things take place, it says, God said to Abraham, Abraham, and God says, here I am, Lord. And God says, I want you to take your son, your only son, whom you love. And I want you to take him to the land of Moriah, and we're going to find a mountain. I'll show you where it is. And I want you to sacrifice him on the altar as a burnt offering. Now let's be clear about what's happening here. He's going to take his only child. He's going to tie him up. He's going to place him on an altar that has wood stacked on the altar. He's going to take a knife. He's going to cut his throat. And then he's going to set the altar on fire and burn the leftovers. This is his son. Who could do such a thing? Who in their right mind would follow that kind of God? Let's just ask the question honestly. Evidently Abraham, because the next morning he gets up, he gets his donkey ready, he calls his son and two servants, he cuts wood and stacks it on the donkey, and they take off for this land. Who would do this? And better question yet, who would follow such a God that would demand those kinds of things? Well, there's a couple of things that occur to me here in sort of an answer, because I don't really have the answer here. Okay, but it's not sleight of hand. These are important facts that you need to know. Abraham lived in a place called Canaan, and in this place, all around him, on all sides, there are all kinds of tribes, different people, different languages, different cultures, and each of those tribes and each of those cultures each have their own set of gods. And every single one of those gods demanded human sacrifice, and in many cases, child sacrifice. Most often, the child was to be one of your own offspring. So while you might think that this just absolutely mortifies you and that is barbaric, to Abraham, this is what you expect out of gods. This is what gods do. This is what forces larger than you and me will demand. It happens, right? Things happen, and they are out of our control. And so you might be thinking, okay, well, I'm glad I don't live in this time, because it is a barbaric time. We could kind of look down our noses at these people and say, they just don't understand. They've got all these superstitions. But I wonder about that, because you know something, folks? We have our own gods as well. And we have our own altars, and we sacrifice on them all the time. Let's just take one. The boss comes to you and says, I'm going to promote you to vice president. And you say, great, I can provide for my family better. Except you also know that with that promotion comes responsibilities. And all of a sudden, all that time that you were spending with your family dries up. The paycheck is bigger. The kids can have anything they want. But the only thing they want is you. We have our altars. And we sacrifice our families regularly on these altars. We feel pain in our hearts. And the pain is something that we are told, if you drink this and enough of these, the pain begins to go away. It numbs the pain. There's a cost to that, isn't there? You do it enough. All of a sudden, this becomes more important than the family around you. It's another altar. It's another sacrifice. We are regularly horse trading one thing for another, and our families get caught in the middle. And they end up getting short shrift. And I could go on and on and on. One sacrifice after the next, after the next. This is what gods do. This is what forces larger than us demand. You want this? You pay me that. And that's what's happening here. And so the second thing that occurs to me is this whole business of God testing Abraham. The other word for test is prove. God proves Abraham. And I don't have an answer as to why God does this, except maybe that it's not so much about a test of Abraham. Abraham, how far will you go to prove that you love me, that you'll do anything for me? Maybe it's a test for God to prove to Abraham that he's not like all the other gods in the world. All the other gods demand sacrifice. All they do is take. This God goes in a completely different direction. Abraham, here I am, Lord. Take your son to the mountain. Worship me. Sacrifice him. It's incomprehensible. But maybe in all of this, God is showing Abraham that he's not that kind of God. And maybe the test for Abraham is, what kind of God do you think I am? I mean, after all, this is a God who, when Abraham gave his wife away to the Pharaoh, while Abraham faltered, God remained true. And this is the God, while Abraham and Sarah gave Hagar to, when Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham and they had a child because they couldn't wait any longer, Abraham falters. This is a God who remains true. Go sacrifice your son. What kind of God do you think I am, Abraham? Maybe that's the question that God's asking, not how far will you go. Scott Rains, down at Lutheran Church of Hope, had an excellent take on this. He compares this story with another story of sacrifice that we know so well. That on one hand, you have Abraham who's ready to sacrifice his son. And on the other hand, you have a God of love who says, no, that's not going to happen. And so Abraham and Isaac walk for 3 days. Jesus is in the tomb for 3 days. Abraham puts the wood for the fire on Isaac's shoulders. God puts the wood of the cross on Jesus' shoulders. This is the best one. Isaac says, we have the fire and we have the knife. Where is the lamb for the sacrifice, for the worship? And Abraham says, God will provide. He doesn't know what's going to happen. God will provide. Jesus is called the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. When things get serious and nothing makes sense, the question that God asks Abraham, the question that God asks you, the question that God asks me is, what kind of God do you think I am? I will never let you be hurt. You will never be far from my care. I will love you. I will see you through anything in this life that will harm or destroy you. Let's sing. So we waited for a month. No answers. Waiting for this test, waiting for that procedure. And every night I fell asleep and I said, why, God? Why? At the end of all of that, the doctor comes back and says, it's osteomyelitis, a bone infection. Serious stuff, but not the C word and not life-threatening. And I will tell you that we were very thankful. To this day, we are very thankful. But that was not the way God proved himself, by saving us from something that would take our son's life. God proved himself by walking with us, by sending us person after person who cared for us, who loved us as only he could love us, who watched over us. He brought us someone we called Grandpa Doctor, because in the emergency room one day, they could not find a vein on a 3-year-old. And so here comes Grandpa Doctor, who is just a lab tech, but this guy is great. And he calms Christian down. Christian is screaming his lungs out, calms him down, and finds the vein right away. And after literally an hour of screaming, Christian falls asleep. God proved himself, not because he spared us from this thing, but because he walked with us. He brought us people that we needed. He kept us safe from all harm. And even had this thing gone in the other opposite direction, I know with all my heart that Jesus would have wrapped Christian in his arms and taken him home. I'm not a perfect person. We do not have perfect faith. But the question was, who is this God that we trust? One more interesting fun fact. The mountain on which Abraham is to sacrifice his son eventually becomes the place where the temple of God is built. It's the place of worship. It's the place where we meet God. Isn't that interesting? For us, when Christian was 3 years old, that was our Moriah. Do you have a Mount Moriah in your life? Maybe it's a funeral home. Maybe it's a hospital room or an exam table where the doctor has something to tell you. Maybe it's a marriage that you feel falling apart at the seams. Maybe it's old age and the ravages and the way it just takes your ability to be independent away. Maybe it's the depression that you live with silently, that no one sees. You smile, and everyone sees the smile on the outside. But there we go, there's that iceberg again. Deep down below is a darkness that you can't wrap your hands around. God's demanding things from us. Is that your Moriah? My friends, that is the place of worship, wherever that place is for you. That is the place where you meet not a false God that can do nothing about such things except continue to take away from you, but the place where you meet the one true God. And the question that he will ask you as you face these unknowns is, who do you think I am? What kind of God am I? How do you think I will lead you through? Amen.